Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. In this video, I'm going to ask, why are some people racist? It's a gargantuan topic and it's egregiously complex. So it's difficult to condense into perhaps half an hour, and even more difficult to do so in a pellucid manner. Now, racism is often crass and cruel, and it can vary from just trifling nastiness all the way up to genocide. Now, there can even be a positive racism, as in a prejudice towards a people rather than against them. And you often hear these things sort of trotted out, that Koreans are generously blessed with cleverness, or the Chinese are industrious, or the Japanese are hygienic, just to pick one region of the world. And of course, some of this is cultural rather than racial. It's not necessarily in the DNA, this sort of behavior. And how true are all these stereotypes? There might be an element of truth, and these positive characteristics wouldn't apply to every single member of that ethnicity. And then to what level do they apply? Clean as in got obsessive compulsive disorder for hygiene, or what? Or just to an average level? It's all debatable. So there's knee-jerk nastiness as well as pleasantness when it comes to racial prejudice. You see claims about black people, some positive prejudice saying that they have athleticism in abundance, or musical ability, or they're fantastic at terpsichoreanism, things like that. Americans are bags of self-confidence. Of course, those two groups overlap. Americans are black people, and Americans are not really an ethnic group. Then you come into nationality in the sense of citizenship, which used to be largely coterminous with an ethnicity, but increasingly they're not, particularly in, let's say, Western European countries with a high level of immigration. I know the writer Musa Okwonga, more accurately knew him as a schoolboy, and he's a Ugandan Briton. And he said when we went to his prep school, he found himself appointed as an unofficial ambassador for black people everywhere, because almost everyone else in the school was white. And he very much disliked this imposition and this responsibility, which was unasked for. And anything he did wrong was then to be held against everybody else of his race. Or if on telly they were mentioning that a black person did this or that or whatever, the other pupils would turn to him to ask him to explain, as though he would know what was going on, or he really happened to have that much in common with people simply because they had roughly the same skin tone as him. So, as I pointed out, some traits, behavioural traits, are more cultural or more individual, and then that gets into the whole nature-nurture debate. The way we behave, to what extent is that just genetic, to what extent is that environmental, and obviously there'll be variations within a group, within the genes of a group, to do with height or intelligence or anything else. Or talk about background, two sisters in the same family, if they're treated exactly the same, they will still turn out to be different, despite having the same ethnicity, the same parentage, and the same opportunities in life, all the rest of it. So ethnic minorities are assimilated to some degree, and then we get on to what level do they take their culture from the host country, to what level do they retain their ancestral culture, and so on. How much are they accepted? Do they have to be deracinated to be accepted? And they may still suffer racism even if they've been in this country they're citizens of for centuries. They might choose to keep themselves. They might choose to completely mix in with the majority population. Then they can be intermarriage. So I want to particularly look at the psychological roots of racism, and psychology is something I've never had a single lesson in, so I can scarcely even scratch the surface. But looking at an area of psychology called Gestalt, from the German word for shape, and this is the principle we have of grouping, as in wanting to put people into groups, perceive them that way. It really simplifies life for us. Or the other one, which is Prägnanz, or Prägnanz, I think is pronounced, which is brevity, the sort of shortcuts we use to cope with the world. So here are some of the principles, the Gestalt principles, and how they apply to racial prejudice. There's the law of proximity. We regard things as being similar to each other as being in a group. And so that's the same, we apply that to people as well, because this speeds things up. We want various cognitive shortcuts because the mental process of trying to figure everybody out and understand each person as an individual is too time-consuming. Notably, if you meet people of a different racial group, you might, first of all, simply perceive them as an amorphous mass and not pay due attention to their individuality. But as you get to know individuals, say, well, he or she is like this or that, and really see them that way. And I've spoken to people with racial prejudice saying, oh, yes, but, you know, it's only when they're a big gang I dislike them. Once I get to know them, that's different, that's fine, I really like him. So people judge by appearances, not just in racial terms. And obviously not everybody judges by appearance. I strive not to do so, even with clothes and things like that. But I can't but help be impressed by clothes sometimes. They often say you never get a second chance to make a first impression. And if people have this deep-seated racial prejudice, positive or negative, it might be difficult to overcome that. Anyway, there's this law of similarity. When things look similar, we assume that they are similar. So the most easily noticeable similarities are colour, shape, size, and other things which apply only to humans, which would like gender. So we think, well, if they all look alike, they must be alike and indeed behave alike, which obviously is an unsafe assumption. There's another principle of psychology, the law of closure. We fill in the gaps, all right? And where there's, like, for example, when you see a dotted shape, a dotted circle, we perceive it as a circle rather than, like, say, 50 separate dots. We supply the bit mentally. We imagine it to be there. Even if we know it's not there, we imagine that it is. Sometimes we know it's not there and we actually trick ourselves into believing that it really is there. When it comes to sort of bad behavior in another ethnic group, if you're predisposed to believe that they have a propensity for whatever behavior, you might imagine they're behaving whatever, or see a group of people from whatever ethnic group who are clustered together, who are high-spirited, and decide that that's a riot. You put 2 and 2 together to make 5. There's the law of common fate. We think that things will move together, act together, and so on, because they are a group. And, you know, not everybody has all these cognitive biases, and those who have them to a certain level, varies according to the person, according to the situation. So we won't always get it wrong. There's a law of continuity, which is being slow to perceive gradual change. Things are sudden and very noticeable, yeah, then we grasp that's happened. But when things happen by tiny increments, we don't realize it's happening. It's like sort of boiling a frog with just heating it up with water very, very slowly or something like that. There's this law of past experience. I met a person who was the same group as you previously, so you must be the same as her in your outlook, in your conduct, and everything like that. And then, no, it's not necessarily like that. That yes, she happens to be of my ethnic group or whatever. I've never met this person. We actually don't have very much in common. All right, and a woman I know, a white woman I know, was in hospital in London, and the nurse said that she was Nigerian. The nurse was obviously black, and this patient was white, saying, well, isn't it really bad what Mugabe is doing? Right, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, very far away from each other. Yes, they're on the same continent, but this is preposterous. I pointed out this woman who's Irish. It's a bit like saying, you're Irish. What do you think of President Putin? I mean, it's only a couple of thousand kilometers away. So we have reproductive thinking, which is based on a previous encounter, right? This was our experience, so we produce it again, saying you will be the same as that person who bore some resemblance to you, simply could be skin tone or facial features. So some people are very gullible, and they can absorb racial memes at a very impressionable age, drink them in with their mother's milk, so to speak. And that's where saloon bar prejudices come from, that all the group are good or bad or gifted or talentless or whatever it could be. And so, my grandfather had a bad experience with a person of that racial group, so they're all damned for all eternity. But my second cousin's Budry Gar's cleaning lady had a good experience with whoever it was, in which case they've all got to be splendid. So, well, an elderly relative of mine, well, he's long since dead, he would say that English women were all whores and that we, the Irish, we're lackadaisical. But this would seem to be self-loathing. Now, negativistic attitudes towards one's own group can show a certain broad-mindedness. Now, of course, we do have idlers amongst us, the Irish, more so than most nationalities. I don't think so. I could be mistaken. I've not seen any data on that. So often we're relying on anecdotal evidence. Now, unless you're a real statistics boff, that's often what you have to go for. And there lies, damn lies in statistics. Which study do you believe? And do you get into the methodology to see if it was a really reliable study? I don't do these things. I don't know. So one thing is you hear a statistic, but also keep an open mind in it. Don't take it as gospel truth. So have good encounters and bad encounters with people of different ethnicities, and that can shape one's attitude. So obviously the media is an enormously puissant cultural influence. Films, television, so on, music, literature. And there was this fascinating study done called Real Bad Arabs. This is years ago now, going back to something like 2002, looking at the depiction of Arabs in Hollywood films. And it showed that 95% of Arab characters were unsympathetic characters, 5% neutral and only 5% likable. And many people cannot distinguish fact from fiction. And I've noticed this a lot in my life, that people have said, but, you know, it's like this situation in that film. I thought that was a work of fiction. It's imaginary. Say, yeah, I know, but that's what they're like. Does life imitate art? Does art imitate life? Well, I think a bit of both. But it certainly shapes real attitudes in the world, these made-up tales. The tales may bear some resemblance to reality. So also onto heuristics. That's the way that we perceive things. We want to relate one thing to something similar. That's the way we understand things. It's a bit like language of explaining words. Well, this one is a bit like that one, only more so or less so, or whatever. This allows us to do things rapidly, and it simplifies things. It just reduces the cognitive load. We work on available information. So you don't know who the Uzbeks are, so you say, well, they're a bit like in between the Russians and the Chinese. You might have some idea of those, and go from there. So familiarity really helps us understand things. Other heuristic principles, which could also lead to racism, they can lead to good things as well. Escalation of commitment, which is, say, you start to believe in something, so then one starts to commit to it ever more deeply, and then you're in too deep. It's a sort of a sunk cost fallacy. Well, I've gone down this road, I might as well go the whole way down this road, because if I pull out, what a disaster, and I would have lost so much. So I have to go all the way. Go the whole hog. Anchor. That's another heuristic principle, that we tend to rely very heavily on the first piece of information. Supposing giving a list of things, people often tend to place excessive value on the first thing that's stated, even if it's actually not the most important. So if you're ever debating or something, say your bit that you believe, the point that you're trying to drive forward first, and your reservation, but I acknowledge there is some merit on the other side. Say that bit, the reservation, at the end. Otherwise, you're doing your opponent's work for them. So the first thing is noticed and gets an undue degree of attention. Recognition heuristics, that's about similarity. The other things, you know, if we recognize something, we think, well, she belongs to that group, so she'll be like the other person from that group. One thing is similar to another. They're not just similar in their outward appearance. It isn't simply phenotype. It must be everything. It must be their attitude. It must be their behavior. Contagion. Well, everybody else believes it, so it must be true. So it spreads around almost like a disease, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, whether it's true or false. We know they're all alike. So we're told what to notice by police, well, especially trying to recall, give me a physical description as an eyewitness. Age, build, colour. I can't remember the others, but there's D, E, F. I don't remember what the other ones stand for. Okay, so we tend to wish to belong to a place, to a people, to a faith sometimes, to an ideological group, all the rest, clubs, families. So people wish to draw boundaries. Now, boundaries can be quite subtle. They can be quite uncertain sometimes. So not a lot of people have the critical faculty to accept ambivalence, and the boundaries are very blurred sometimes, and to accept that, yeah, there is nuance to these things. And look at skin tone, black and white. There are endless gradations between the darkest skinned person in the world and the whitest skinned person in the world. And to accept, well, they're not just the three major groups. We used to talk about Negroid, Caucasian, and Mongoloid. But where are Indians? They're Caucasian. So the Caucasian is such a broad group is more or less meaningless. And how black is black? What if you're half black, half white? Which one are you? Both? Neither? What if you're 3/4 black and 1/4 white? Are you black then, or white, or an intermediate group? What if it's the other way around, 3/4 white and 1/4 black? Which are you? So I don't have a strong view on this. It doesn't matter to me, but it matters very deeply to some people. And how about Aborigines? They tend to have very dark skin. Are they Negroid or not? I would say they're probably not. Again, it doesn't really matter to me. Or people of Southeast Asian countries, if they've got fairly dark skin for that part of the world, some of the Indonesians, are they black or not? I would say they're probably not. They're probably a kind of a Mongoloid, but it's debatable. Arabs, very pale-skinned Arabs, are they white? I think they are, actually. I think Arabs are a linguistic group. Others would say it's not. Some of the northern Arabs say, yeah, I speak Arabic, I'm Syrian, but I'm not an Arab, I'm a Syrian. Arab, that's from the Arabian Peninsula. A lot of people wrongly say that Iranians are Arabs. They're not. They're Persian speakers, 98% of them, or Azerbaijani speakers and so on. So accepting that something can show up in two categories, there can be an intersection of sets, like an event diagram, and all that is very involved and complex and beyond many people. So those who care very deeply about race are very pronounced views on it, and they want there to be hard and fast lines. They want to categorize, they want to separate, they want to demonize. So they tend to have a very keen eye for racial detail, and because they're eager to tell people apart. But then they're discombobulated when a lot of people defy any simple classification. So it discomposes those who wish to be racial determinists. So racists are very pettifogging about who belongs in which group, but often they're very poorly informed. Who belongs where? Putting people in their place. I'll come back to that notion. I remember I had a classmate in a course I was on absolutely years ago, British guy. He was an ethnic minority chap, and a very agreeable sort, but I got to know him and I felt confident enough that he'd react well enough to this question. I said, are you black or Indian? I can't figure it out. But he was mainly ethnically black. He had some white ancestry as well. So you can't necessarily tell at a glance what somebody is. Or like in the United States, people often speak as though black and Hispanic are mutually exclusive. And they're not. I mean, not even just through intermarriage, they're not. But for example, there are black Mexican people, there are black Peruvian people, black Panamanian, black Colombian people, and their language is Spanish, they are Hispanic, and it's a linguistic group rather than an ethnic group. So whites have often been trying to keep themselves apart and think that they should be unalloyed because some of them were racist and believed in so-called racial purity, because whites who are sometimes greedy and they monopolize political power. Now, I know people of other ethnic groups have done this as well, but usually not on an explicitly racist basis or an explicitly colour basis, that it really is to do with skin tone for some people. Now, I had a Chinese Malaysian friend, and he would call me Guilo. I'm absolutely fine with that, which is ghost person, sometimes translated foreign devil. So I think we shouldn't be too touchy about racial epithets. Much depends on tone and context. Or there can be these sectarian ones, like one of my Protestant friends from County Down calling me Tague, but I'm fine with that. I know she's not sectarian, she likes me. Anyway, so come back to the colour thing. Some Spanish people, some Italians are very swarthy, and their skin could be darker than a so-called black person. And yet they're categorized this way and that way, but it's to do with features. So it's not really to do with skin tone. So even the words black and white are misleading. I mean, I know whites were more like pink or maybe just a very, very light brown. And black people are almost never literally black in their skin. So look at Berbers, some of the indigenous people of Africa living in the Atlas Mountains, and some of them are as pale as I am, and their facial features aren't very distinct from an average white person. So are they white? I suppose they are. And that would really mess up some of the particularly closed-minded white supremacists who say, oh, black people, real African people are black, and so on. So many people are distressingly asinine in insisting that words mean what they don't actually mean. Not accepting that a dark-skinned Spaniard who is indigenously Spanish is not as white, in the real sense of white, as a very pale-skinned black person. No, I'm not just talking about a Berber. And some leftists who are fixated with this as well, they get this wrong, how the Irish became white by an Irish American. So we weren't white. I mean, certainly there was anti-Irish prejudice in the United States, particularly anti-Irish Catholic prejudice, but we weren't regarded as being white. So I know sometimes we're mistreated, but it's not to say that we weren't regarded as being white. Sometimes people are calling us white Negroes. It doesn't bother me one bit if people call us that. I'd be happy to be a Negro. We don't tend to use that word anymore. It's just regarded as old hat. So I've met exceptionally pale Pakistanis. Are they white or not? Arguably they are. I mean, they're meant to be descendants of Alexander the Great's soldiers, his hoplites or whatever you call them, phalanxes. So all these exceptions, they prove these flaws in these white supremacist arguments and show that you can't starkly divide. So people need to exclude if they're to have a really distinct sense of belonging. And these sharp racial distinctions have little credibility and not much basis in reality. So we need some self-awareness, and that would lead us to accept that we're all related. We all come from the Rift Valley. And DNA tests throw this into sharp relief, that very, very few people have their ancestry entirely from one region of the world. I mean, that's within traceable history. Obviously, 3 million years ago, we all come from the same zone. If you're looking as far back as 1 million years ago, we're actually all mixed. If you're looking far back as 100,000 years ago, almost everyone have an ancestor from somewhere further away. Recorded history is only 5,000 years old. So that's the blinking of an eye in the terms of the existence of our species. So it's amusing to see some of these people discover their race. Now, I remember reading this famous article in 2002 in The Guardian about this white South African couple who were pro-apartheid, as in pro the racist laws to keep the races separated. And their daughter was born, and their daughter was very dark-skinned, not fully black, but you might think she was half black. So when these Dutch immigrants landed in Kaapstad in the 17th century, they were overwhelmingly men. Some of them formed relationships with black women. Children were born, blah, blah, blah. There were these children, half white, half black. But then some of them would marry whites, and the children would be a quarter black, and then marry whites again, and an eighth black, and almost seemed white and just accepted into the white community. And that black ancestor was forgotten because there was such racial bigotry and spite that this would have been regarded as shameful. But that gene could be dormant for several generations and then expressed, and this is what happened in the birth of that woman. So much identity can be invested in belonging to some group and being entirely a member of that group. Anyway, the stark contrasts in behaviour, I would suspect, are more cultural than racial and can completely change. Like take some of the black people of the West Indies who behave in their own distinctive way, I suppose, to some extent, some of those Caribbean islands, and would have an overlay of, say, British or French influence too, and perhaps wouldn't behave so much like countries where their ancestors may have hailed from, like Guinea-Bissau or Ghana or wherever it may be. Okay, well, Ghana, they got some British influence too, or Mali or wherever it may be. And they kept some of their culture going, even though they're very much the majority in these Caribbean islands, people of African stock. So people sometimes tend to have less compassion for those of other races. And prejudice, that's it. It's this wish to simplify, to categorize, to judge before you know the individual. Prejudice. So Dr. Nathaniel Coleman, he's a black British academic, and he talked about it's all about putting people in their place, and not even in a cruel or negative sense. Like when a security guard told him to leave the library because he's an undergraduate, students aren't allowed to stay, but he's an academic, and the security guard was black. Thought that he was doing the right thing, but actually Dr. Coleman wished to say this is an example of racism, but no, I think it's just because he looks young. So some people are desperate to perceive racism when it doesn't exist and exaggerate it. We have enough real racism, we don't need to invent any more. So we make assumptions, people tend to jump to conclusions, and it takes greater self-assurance, patience, and frankly intelligence to say that we don't know, or sometimes we have possibility, probability, and not to try and go that further bit and say that we're sure when we're not. Someone I knew with racial prejudice saying, oh, this person, well, yeah, he definitely did, and he's probably involved in that crime and so on. Saying, you can't make these assumptions. That's very unwise. So we ought to accept that the world is untidy. I remember Professor Richard Dawkins saying when he was at Oundle, they said the different houses, they had a character. This is the idea, that they all behave in a similar manner. And he said, really, that was drivel, but people just like to believe that. It makes life easier. So this is what stereotypes are about. Now, stereotypes don't come from nowhere. They often contain a grain of truth. Usually it's exaggerated. It's a caricature. You take some feature and then you overstate it to a grotesque degree. And they're very often out of date. So culture and race, as I say, are hard to distinguish. And we come up with these self-fulfilling prophecies, labeling people. You lot behave like this. You're good at that. You're bad at that. And they believe it and they act up to it and they might think it's true. They get fooled into believing that. So that English people being arrogant, often said. And so they hear that. And so they're saying, well, to be English, then I will be arrogant and come across like that. And not all English people are arrogant. And not everybody who's not English is not arrogant either. Or Irish people being alcoholic. And sometimes we think, oh, well, that means we're fun and loquacious. And yeah, lacks out to it as a matter of national pride. Have a laugh about that. You know, for crack, we'll have a few scoops, have a few jars, things like that. It will be gas, as they used to say in Cork. About the Scots being mean, I'm not sure if they ever want to act up to that one. Or as for the Welsh, well, I won't say it. No, I won't sing like them. You see, the old racial prejudice come out there. Or black men being macho, these stereotypes. And so some people think we ought to play up to it. Or fantastic at sports. I remember reading a book entitled N at Eton by Dillaby Onyema. N, it's a word that rhymes with trigger. And he said that it was a fairly good bowler in cricket. But a lot of the boys, they honestly believed that he was dim because it was his race. It's not your fault that you keep failing your exams. And they believed that he was fabulous at sports. And he could see the fear on the face of the batsman before he bowled, and he said it was their sheer terror that got them out, not my virtuosity. So it worked in his favour. So it's scintillating to see how people make exemptions for so-called good members of a race whom they despise. Like someone I know, a nurse, she was saying all these vile anti-black things. But then she'd have a colleague who was black whom she really, really liked, would say, yes, but she's a real lady, she's first class, she's different. Trying to argue, but wait a second, doesn't that prove that the whole idea is nonsense? If they're bad because of their race, they're all bad. It can't be just one of them is good or something like that. And if they're not all bad, the principle goes. You've got to judge them as individuals. But no, she wasn't willing to give them a chance. Saying, okay, so-and-so, members of whichever race, they mistreated you. Have members of our own race mistreated you? Yeah, sure they have. So does that mean that we're all damnable? No, it doesn't. For some reason. So that's why it's a racial prejudice. To say, okay, not all of them, but most of them are blah, blah, blah. I say, let's stop doing that. Let's just give them a chance. So racism, it may well be natural, which is not to say it's good, it's wrong. We have bad urges. Our instincts are often bad. They could be paedophilic urges. They could be violent urges. Some people are psychopathic. Some people could be kleptomaniacs, things like that. So some people are pathological liars, so we have to control our urges. It's not good enough. We have overcome that. That's what being civilized is about. So racial prejudice, I mean, I've shown it sometimes. It's not that bad. Maybe it's a cultural prejudice. Asking a Japanese guy if he did karate. It's not the worst thing in the world. And he said no. He was faintly irked by that, saying there's this misconception that we in the West that we all do martial arts. It's not true, even though they started there. Like the idea that I would do Irish dancing or that I like Guinness. I don't actually. I don't mind people wondering that, or often asking if I like whiskey. So our notions about other lands are often outdated and over the top. But sometimes they contain an element of truth. They don't come from outer space. So you notice the way that differences are overemphasized for the sake of consolidating group solidarity and differences from the other group, and our similarities amongst the one group, our commonalities are the commonalities, sorry, with other groups, they're de-emphasized. We don't have much in common. A bit like you hear other Irish people saying, we are totally different from the English. Well, no human groups are totally different from each other, but okay, even at a relative level, we might be totally different from the Turkmens. We might be totally different from the Bolivians or something. That's a stretch. Totally different from the Burundians. Even then, I can think of a few similarities, like Christianity or there. But we can't be totally different from our neighbours with whom we're very mixed in. So look at Irish DNA, that will prove that. And look at English DNA. And then what is even English or Irish? We excluding the ethnic minorities, the non-white minorities. So trust and distrust is often based on photos. These psychological studies, this sort of prison negotiation thing. You're in a different room, you've got to negotiate with him. Are you going to inform on each other? And if you both inform each other, you go to prison for so long. If you both deny any wrongdoing, refuse to inform, you could both go free. But he could send you to jail and go free himself and blah, blah, blah. Or negotiating over money. These sort of ones that if you agree to share the money, get a certain amount. But if you betray the other, you could walk away with all the money, things like that. So, and people are more likely to trust on the basis of racial similarity and more likely to distrust on the basis of racial dissimilarity. And it's not to do with the word so much as the photo they're shown. So it's disturbingly deep-seated racial prejudice. Is it acculturated? I suppose it is to some extent, but in a way that's heartening because it shows that we have the opportunity to overcome it, to eradicate it. But it's dismayingly resilient. It probably has existed everywhere at every time. It's just been worse, more outspoken, more severe, crueler at certain times and certain places. And individuals, viciously racist individuals, can overcome and recant. That's great. People not racially prejudiced at all can become that way, which is obviously disturbing. So it can be destroyed, but then be resurrected, like in Yugoslavia. No ethnic prejudice in the 1980s, so it seemed, and by the 90s, people were slaughtering each other. So we can have unconscious bias, unwitting prejudice. It's not always malevolent. So those are some of my thoughts on racism, which is a scourge that I'd like to rid the world of.